The thing I see most about Shalom bias is just that appreciate the beauties that the other person has. Every person has assets, and just appreciate what they have. The big mistake that people make is they try to compare relationships, and this guy is this woman's husband, well, he does this and he does that, and everyone's different, and every relationship is different. That's not really what we're talking about today. One of the things that does make for a happy home is when men understand the special gift of women's bina. To first get into the idea of bina, you may or may not be familiar with the Gemara that talks about a pasuk in Bereshis. And I'll tell you when we go to the source sheets. I didn't put everything on the source sheets, but there's a pasuk in Bereshis that says that when Hashem was creating the world, it says that on the sixth day he created Adam. And it says, Zachar unekeva bara osam. He created Adam as a male and female at the same time. So there's different mafarshim that talk about that, whether it was a creature that walked back to back or however it was, but it seems that there was a single entity called Adam, which was male and female. And then later it was separated and they were changed into separate entities, male and female. There's other ideas behind it also, because in Sheni of Bereshis, it talks about Adam complaining that he did not have a mate, where like all the other species, and Hashem took a rib and created a separate entity from him. But there's two different versions exactly of where Chava came from. But the first version, which is in the first Aliyah of Bereshis, is that Adam and Chava were created as a single entity, Zachar unekeva bara osam. And the Gemara in Tainus talks about when Hashem divided Adam and Chava into two different beings, that it wasn't a 50-50 split. There were certain attributes that were given more to men and certain that were given more to women. I hope the woke police are not here right now. I'm going to say some very controversial things. Physical strength was given 70% to men, 30% to women. Shocker. Who knew, right? Size, height was given in larger amounts to men. Another shocker. The koach of dibor, of speech, was given 70% to women. It was not a 50-50 split. The Gemara talks about dea, the idea of logical thought, was given in a higher amount, 65% to men, whereas bina was given 80% to women. Bina is what we typically refer to as intuition, or just a sense, an indescribable sense, certainly unperceivable to somebody like me. But there are times even where men have instincts and things of that nature where they rely on their instincts. But this idea of bina, a sixth sense, was given in much more of a heavy amount to women. So listen, the idea that men and women are exactly the same is it's so ridiculous that it's not even worth talking about. But nevertheless, the Gemara talks about how you have to maximize the abilities of each. It just shocks me sometimes. I would be studying and thinking and trying to figure something out, and my wife would say, well, why don't we just do da-da-da-da? I'm like, gosh, that's easy. It's just different ways of looking at things. Now, I might get that from someone else outside the home too. Different people have different ideas about things, but it's striking how the male and female minds work differently. So that's this part of idea of bina, and the fact is that the Gemara says it wasn't an equal division. Women have it in much more. Beyond that, what we're going to try to talk about today is how to balance this selflessness of that's inherent in women and inherent in motherhood, with the ability and the necessity of doing self-care, of watching out for oneself. We'll try to explore this through some Torah options, and that's where the source sheets are going to come in. So look at your source sheet at source number 1. This is I think all the sources we're using today are from the Chumash. So this is a simple thing talking about, you may be familiar with the story, that Paro ordered Shifra and Pua, Yocheved and Miriam, to kill the boys as they were being born. And if they were girls, he would let them live. And I underline the relevant portions. You'll see in Benhu Vamisanoso, if they're a son, you kill them. Vimbas he v'choya. And if it's a girl, you let it live. And then in the next underlined section, it says, V'lo asuka sheri beralehem melech Mitzrayim. They didn't follow his order. But to yenes ayilodim, they let the children live. Now, let's just stop for 1 second and understand what we're talking about. We're talking about one of the most merciless brutal monarchies ever that there was. It wasn't just the Jews that were subjugated. Mitzrayim had wholesale slavery for generations. That's how their economy was built. There was class warfare of the utmost kind. The nobility and the royalty had everything, and everybody else was a peasant and survived at the feet of the crumbs that they were thrown. This was a brutal regime. And now we have two people who, by the grace of God, have been given a important job of killing the Jewish children, the Jewish boys. And they're going to say, you know what? I'm not happy with this job. I think I'm going to risk getting the king mad at me. And for that, there's only one punishment, which is death. Now, there's a lot of men who are good people, self-sacrificing, would probably give up their lives for their children, but would they give up their lives for someone else's children? Maybe. I don't know. But apparently for Yocheved and Miriam, this was ABCs. I'm not saying it wasn't easy for them. I'm sure it was a thought process, but to just glance over this pasuk and not appreciate the magnitude of it, this was going on a wholesale level. Every baby that's being born to the Jewish people, they are making an active decision that we're not going to kill it. It's an unbelievable thing. They're putting their own lives in danger, not just in danger, but almost certain death. And if you go down towards the bottom of the page where it's underlined, it says, Vayihi ki yiru hamiyaldos elokim, vayaz lehem batim. Hashem appreciated this fear that they had, and that they didn't kill the children, and therefore he made for them houses. Yeah. I mean, there's so many psukim in the Torah that talk about how everything's midah keneged midah, and the punishment fits the crime, and the reward fits the deed. And here, this is not some obscure Rashi or Medrash somewhere. This is the pasuk. These are Hashem's words. Look at what the women did. I'm going to make them nice houses. And I don't even know what that means. So some of the Mefarshim really struggle to touch their elbows to their nose, and they say, well, what it means is that they were forced to live in these terrible shacks where the women would give birth, and that's where they were 24/7. They had no amenities of any kind that even the regular slaves had at home, so Hashem gave them nice houses in the fields. Again, nice explanation, but how does that fit the great deed that they're doing? So look at Rashi here. This is so fundamental. Rashi, you'll see at Pasuk Chaf Aleph, it's just under the large print, and the smaller print still at the bottom of source 1. I'm sorry, it's a little bit rubbed out, but it says Vayaz lehem batim, and it says Bate Kahuna Umalchi, Bate Levia, Bate Kahuna Levia Umalchus, and it goes on to say how the Kahuna and the Levia came from Yocheved, and Malchus came from Miriam. Miriam was married to Kalev, and from them came Malchus based Dovid. So Rashi's giving us a little cryptic idea of what's really going on here. We're not talking about physical houses. And again, a basic yesod, which you should understand about Rashi, is that Rashi only writes something when the pasuk itself lends itself to a question. So Rashi himself was troubled by what we're talking about. What are these houses? So normally we'd expect Rashi to tell us, so this is what it means by houses. And he says, Bati Levia, Bati Kahuna, Bati Malchus. Okay, that's more than I had before. I know what kind of batim I'm talking about, but I'm still left with my original question with how is that an appropriate reward for the sacrifice and the danger that Miriam and Yocheved were placing themselves in? So I heard this idea from my father many years ago. It's one of my favorite ideas from him. And he says, well, let's think about what would have happened if Miriam and Yocheved had listened to Paro. There would have been no Jewish men. There would have only been Jewish women. So Klal Yisrael would have survived through the female line. They would have married Mitzrayim men, and they would have had children, and those children would have been Jewish. And at least through the female line, Judaism would have been preserved. But what would have been lost? There would have been no Levium, no Kohanim, and no Malchus, because those are paternally transmitted. So that was the reward that Hashem gave them. Because of you, there's going to be Levium, there's going to be Kohanim, and there's going to be Malchus. And because of the deed that you did, they're going to be descended from your children. It's a beautiful, beautiful explanation. But I think that really circles back to one of the main things that I want to convey. There is a terrible tide that started with, there's some good things in the women's movement that started in the 60s and 70s, but there's some bad things in it too. equal pay for equal jobs. That's a great idea. Respecting men and women equally, of course that's important. That women should be able to be in the workforce without being harassed and things of that nature. Of course, those are all important things. But there's other things that came about which aren't necessarily the best things. And it starts off with this idea, again, that everything's equal. Everything is not equal. We're not the same. And one of the things that we have to understand is that the root of the people pushing that agenda is insecurity. They don't realize that in many ways women are superior to men, whether it's through Bina or through other things. But this is not speculation. These are facts. The fact of the matter is, if either of you, let's use a different example, if any Jewish woman would marry a guy, your children are still Jewish. I can be the most pious person in the world and all learn Torah all day, and somehow someone convinces me to try some marijuana one day, and I decide to father a child with a non-Jewish woman. It doesn't matter how long my beard is or how much Torah I know. That child is not Jewish. Only a Jewish woman can produce a Jewish child. That's an amazing thing. There's something inherent in the female neshama that is fundamentally different than the male one. And the idea somehow that Judaism is sexist, it's only sexist if you're jealous. In other words, if I'm jealous of the fact that you can produce a Jewish child, I've got a great idea. See, all the men are the ones who wrote all the Gemaras and all the Mishnayos and all the Halachos. Let's change the law. And let's say that Jewish men now are the ones who can produce a Jewish child. I might as well try to change a cow into a horse. Can't be done. Only a Jewish woman can produce a Jewish child. There's an inherent kedusha in Jewish women that is far superior to anything men bring to the table. I hate to say this in mixed crowds, fortunately this isn't one, but the fact of the matter is something you all need to know. There's a halacha sefer called the Mishnah Brura, which you've probably heard of. The Mishnah Brura was written about 110 years ago by the Chafetz Chaim. The Chafetz Chaim was the greatest man of his generation, and he faced a challenge, which is that we have these old books called the Shulchan Aruch and the Rambam, treatises from the 1200s, spelling out all Jewish halacha. And he said, listen, the world has changed between the year 1200 and the year 1950 and the year 1850. We need to bring some of these up to date for the last 700 years and understand how plowing a field might be different in the 1900s and the 1800s than it was in the 1200s, and the things you can do on Shabbos and what's considered muktzah and how has Tchum changed. Does it matter if there's houses built on? All these different things that no one even contemplated in the year 1200. And the Chafetz Chaim took it upon himself to modernize, not in the conservative reform method, not to change anything, but to make it applicable. Just for example, Moshe Feinstein did the same thing in the 1970s when he wrote all types of halachas on in vitro fertilization and all types of technologies that didn't exist. You know, halacha, the reason Gemara is written in a question-answer format is because that way you can look at the thought behind the rule and apply it to modern-day things. So that's really what the Mishnah Brura is trying to do. But in any event, the Mishnah Brura, for those of you who don't know, really sets out to tell a man, not a woman, tell a man, how to live his life from the moment he wakes up in the morning till the moment he goes to bed at night. And it starts with, of course, what's the first thing we do every morning? Nagelwasser. What Jewish person doesn't wash his hands? We know 1, 2, 3. Everybody knows the whole method. Invented in the 19th century. The Rambam expresses in the 1200s how people have to wash their hands in the morning because they may have touched themselves improperly during the middle of the night, so you have to get the tomb off you. He says you have to wash your hands in the morning. It's a simple thing. You got to wash your hands in the morning. No. Comes along the Chafetz Chaim and says, no, it's not enough to wash your hands. There has to be a ritual because rituals mean something. If we have a ritual, we're more likely to do it right and be careful in how we do it. If we just wash our hands, we have time, we don't have time, maybe I'll get dressed first, then I'll wash my, whatever. No, says the Mishnah Brura, you have to wash your hands in this methodical way as soon as you wake up in the morning. And then you have to get dressed in a certain way. There's a certain shoe that has to go on first. And after you put that shoe on first, you have to tie the other one first. Don't even ask me how complicated it gets if you have buckle shoes. Oh my gosh, that's a whole new treatise. But the Mishnah Brura set out to make sure that every second of a person's life, a man's life in particular, is set out. Now, why is that? Simple. Here's lesson number one you can't possibly relate to because you're women, just like I can't relate to all the things that go on through your mind. A man in his natural state is a reclining chair with a beer in his hand. That is man in his natural state. You do not understand the struggles that every man faces to actually get up in the morning, to daven, to go to work. They do these things because they're required and necessary. It is completely anti who they are. Man in his natural state is a beachfront or a hammock. This is who they are. And that's why most of them, sometimes the quest for money overcomes them, and that gets more than anything. But if that's not the case, most men will strive and struggle and do everything they can for 50 weeks a year so they have 1 week to be on a beachfront or 1 week to be on vacation. Just 1 week to do nothing, which is why there's also this concept called the man cave, right? Because, well, I'm going to save that for later. It's just too good. Anyway, so this is the idea of understanding, first of all, the selflessness of women and what Yocheved and Miriam did to daily put their lives in danger, where any one of the taskmasters could have killed them without question. And Paro would have said, you did good. We'll find someone else to deliver the babies. Your job is to kill the babies. You don't do them. There's a consequence for that. That's number one. Number two is prayer. And that's source number two. I cannot possibly give any talk on the nature of women's special talents without mentioning tefillah. The Gemara also says that tefillahs of women and children are particularly precious to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that is because of what we kind of touched on a little bit. Women are inherently more spiritual creatures than men are. Men understand and they learn. That's the Dea. It's the Dea gene again. It's a logical thought. Okay, there must be a God because someone had to create all this. Okay, then you have men who are saying, but yeah, but there's a Big Bang and there's evolution, all these other, and men use their mind processors to try to figure out and develop faith. Women on a much grander scale just inherently are faithful people. They're much more spiritual people. I have groups where I talk to 150 people and I ask all of them, close your eyes, nobody can see what the other one's saying. If 13 terrorists had not decided to fly their planes into the World Trade Center on 9/11, how many people think that those people would have died that day anyway? 90% of the women's hands go up. Fate, that's what Hashem intended. It allows them to sleep at night. In the men, it's about 50-50. Again, I'm not saying who's right or who's wrong, but the different ways that the mind works. Men have to feel like they're in control somehow. Women feel much better if they're an idea that someone is running the show, whatever the case may be. But there's differences between men and women. And this idea that, every bullet has its name on it or things of that nature. But prayer, most people totally underestimate the impact of prayer. And again, let's step back for a minute and think about this, because I have to tell you, when I was in my 20s and becoming a rabbi, I got to this point where I had such a connection to my learning that I really didn't understand why prayer works. Now, you look at me like I got three heads, because most people do. But think about it. We believe in a perfect creature called God, a perfect entity, an entity which contemplates all possibilities, all ramifications, and makes the perfect decision. But somehow comes along little Dovid Fink, and he's going to whisper or even yell in God's ear and say, but what about Rachel? Oh, good point. I hadn't thought of that. It's almost sacrilegious. The idea that my making an appeal can somehow impact a previously perfect judgment. It implies that the judgment before was either less than perfect, or God is now rendering something imperfect now because of my tefillah. Either of which is unacceptable. Agreed? Right. Most people don't think of that. Of course, I'm davening because we daven, and Hashem listens to us. Well, what was he doing before? When he rendered the original gezerah or decision, we even say those exact words in the Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur davening, Ma'avirin es roah hagezerah. We're going to change the bad decree. Who are you? You insignificant bug. You're going to change God's mind? I don't know what kind of God you believe in, but my God doesn't get influenced by extraneous factors. It's a bomb question, which most people never think of. I had a lot of free time in my youth. So I ran across a Ramban once. The Ramban talks about something really unrelated, but I think it is related. And the Ramban talks about this idea that there's very few things in the Hebrew language where we see two words meaning the same thing. We only have one word for love and like. So, hey, Hebrew does not have a whole lot of words like great, huge, big, giant. No, we don't do that in Hebrew. There's one word that means something. It's very simple. But yet, there's two words that mean I. We have ani and we have anochi. Ani is typically used for humans, and anochi is typically used for Hashem when he's referring to himself in the first person. There are exceptions when people sometimes use anochi, but generally speaking, those are the way it's divided. But it's very unusual on its face for there to be two words in the Hebrew language that mean the same thing. There are exceptions to that too. There's a few. And the Ramban says this idea, he wants to know why we have two words, ani and anochi, that means the same thing. And he comes to the conclusion that, well, an and anochi really mean the same thing, and they come from the same shoresh, which is an, which means I. He says, and the reason there's a slightly different version for humans than it is for God is because human beings are part of God. There's a game changer. What does that mean? So again, the Ramban, if you ever have the art scroll version of the Ramban and Chumash, they often get to a section where it says, this section here is beyond the scope of this work, so we have not printed it. That means it's Kabbalah. Okay? Now, in the original versions of the Ramban where they talk about this, the Ramban goes into this idea where he says that, well, people, when Hashem created the world, if Hashem was here in all of his honor and glory, there'd be no room for any of us. It'd be like a constant nuclear explosion going on. Just his presence would overwhelm everything. There'd be no room for us. So it's fascinating the way it's described in the Kabbalah Sfarim. It says that basically Hashem represents this ultra, super concentrated form of goodness. And it's so tightly wound and compact on a concentrated level that we can't even relate to it. Now take any type of substance and put it in a beaker, and then close the beaker, and then heat it up. What happens eventually? Speak. Well, eventually, yeah. What happens if that beaker is closed? Exactly. So the Kabbalistic Sfarim describe this as the origins of the universe. It's unbelievably similar to the Big Bang. I love these people who try to rationalize and say the Torah is right and the Big Bang is wrong and science is wrong and the Torah is right. Most of the time they're in harmony. And when they're not in harmony, it's because science hasn't caught up with the Torah yet. But the Kabbalistic Sfarim describe the origins of the universe of this ultra sense of goodness being so compact that eventually, boom, it explodes. And what happened was millions of things, but one of them is our universe. And that's why, did you ever wonder, even men, who are not the most sensitive creatures in the world, we feel good when we do good things. Most of us don't walk down the street and kick a cat. Why would you want to do that? There are some people who are dropped as a child and suffer from issues like that, but most men, forget about women, it's a given with women, but most men, they feel good when they do good things. Now, why is that we're wired that way? Why would we? That's totally counter-evolutionary. Evolution would dictate we do what feels good, and we do what helps us survive. There is no reason for us to do anything benevolent. That is anti-evolutionary. There should not be a benevolent bone in our body. Nothing. There should not be an inkling, not be a thought. It's counter-evolutionary. And the explanation is simple. Because we were created from God, and God is the ultimate goodness. So we are pre-wired like that. Now take this a little bit further now. The Kabbalistic Sfarim go on to indicate that, as we said before, if Hashem was here in all of his honor and glory, there'd be no room for anything else. So Hashem had to create what's called a tzimtzum. A tzimtzum is a barrier. You're familiar with the psukim that say Moshe Rabbeinu wanted to see Hashem, and Hashem said, no, you can't see me, but I'll let you see me from the back or through a veil or something of that nature. And that's because Hashem had to erect a barrier between him and this world so that this world could have a place to exist. So the Kabbalistic Sfarim, they talk about it like Hashem withdrew himself 99.99% from our universe. He withdrew to over here, set up a barrier so that his presence will not be over here. But a small imprint of him was left. Part of that imprints are everywhere that you can see. For example, the imprint on land was left on Eretz Yisrael. The imprint on people was left on humans or Jewish people, depending on which Sfarim you're reading. Maybe left on all humans, but on a greater extent on Jewish people. But that imprint is part of us, and that's what the Ramban is talking about. The Ramban is explaining that we are actually part of Hashem. We are the part of Hashem that can exist in the physical world. Most of Hashem can't exist in the physical. He's not a physical creature. And if he was here, there'd be no world at all. So he had to shield himself, get himself out of this world, mostly leave an imprint behind or a remnant behind, if you will. And the Ramban says that's humankind, as far as what can exist as a being in the physical world. Well, if you take that Ramban a little bit further, we can answer this question that we had a minute ago, which is, why on earth would tefillah work? Because the idea that some small amoeba is having some impact on Hashem is ludicrous. If you actually think about it. Sometimes it's easier just not to think about it. But if you take this Ramban, it makes very good sense. Because just like Hashem has the midah of Rachamim and midah Sadin and midah of Gura, all types of attributes of Hashem, humankind is one of those attributes. We are not some external force trying to impact Hashem. Rather, we're inside. We are part of the cheshbon. We're part of the accounting and part of the process. Which, I don't know about you, but for me, that forever changed Dovid. I'm no longer an amoeba trying to impact a grand being. I'm now part of the grand being. I'm one of those voices in the head, if you will. It changes everything, the way and why our tefillah works. Now, that doesn't mean that we can always carry the day. There are other factors that Hashem considers when he reaches every decision. But we are part of the factor. Now, in order to completely finish this loop, you have to get into the past, present, future, and time, and how Hashem exists at a time. But I only have 4 hours today, so we're not going to do that right now. But just the idea of tefillah is inherently a female attribute, which is much more superior to men. Women are much more spiritual creatures in general, and tefillah goes with the idea of womankind. And that's source number 2. I just want to give you an idea of the magnitude of tefillah and what it can impact. This is a pasuk from Toldos. You're all familiar that all the imahos struggled to have children. They weren't granted to have children immediately. The Mepharshim explain one of two possibilities that they talk about. Either Hashem wanted to hear the tefillos of the imahos and the avos, so he made them wait for children so they would daven for children. Or number 2 is that when someone has to wait for something, when there's delayed gratification, they place a much higher value on it. And Hashem wanted to make sure the avos and the imahos treasure their children, not just had them. So Rivka and Yitzchak are struggling to have children, and the pasuk that's underlined in source number 2 is a pivotal one about tefillah. Vaye'etar Yitzchak l'Hashem, l'Noach ishto ki akarahi. Yitzchak and Rivka couldn't have children, and this is Yitzchak and Rivka davening. Now, this lashon of vaye'etar, if you look in the small print underneath, is a very unusual lashon of tefillah. If I was going to ask either of you or either of your friends, what is the way that we say tefillah in Hebrew, you would probably say either tefillah, which is the word hitpalel, or even words in Shemos, which are like vayitzaku, someone cries out, things of that nature. Those are lashons of tefillah. Vaye'etar is a very unusual lashon of tefillah, which Rashi says talks about the unprecedented intensity and unprecedented relentlessness. That's how Rashi describes it, that no one had ever davened pounding on the gates of Shemayim without stop, like Yitzchak and Rivka. That's the lashon of Vaye'etar. And there's a whole discussion about why they had to do that. But nevertheless, understand the level of tefillah that we're talking about here. And the Medrash explains that when Yitzchak started to daven for children, Malachim rushed to the Kisei Shel Kavod, Hashem's throne, and said, Hashem, it's Yitzchak. Yitzchak was arguably the most Kaddish of all the others. He was a Karban. He was the Akedah. And he wasn't even allowed to leave Eretz Yisrael. He was so Kaddish. And why did he have to daven harder than everybody else? Harder than Abraham, harder than Yaakov. So the Medrash explains when Yitzchak started davening, Malachim rushed to the Kisei Shel Kavod and said, Hashem, it's Yitzchak. You have to listen to his tefillos. And Hashem was inclined to agree. But then other Malachim said, no, you can't. Why not? So you may or may not be familiar with this. You're familiar with the concept that all the Avos were supposed to live to be 180 years old? All the Avos were supposed to live to be 180 years old. Yaakov lost certain years from his life because of, he kept referring to himself as my Eved to Yaakov and things of that nature when he's supposed to be an Eved to Hashem. There's different things that they cheshbonos. Yitzchak did live to be 180. Avram lived to 175. And the Mefarshim explained that Avram only lived to 175 because Hashem did not want him to see Esav commit the 3 cardinal sins in one day. So he took him 5 years early. So he wouldn't have that pain of seeing his grandson become a Rasha. So these other Malachim came to the Kisei Shel Kavod and they said to Hashem, wait a second, you've already been goes there that you're going to take Abraham 5 years early so he doesn't see Esav become a Rasha. If you accept Yitzchak's tefillah now, then Esav's going to be born earlier, and you're going to have to take Abraham even earlier. That's what the Medrash says, which, wow, the ramifications of this are unbelievable, because what that means is that Yitzchak's davening for a child, unbeknownst to him, he's also davening for his father to die. Of course, he has no idea. But understand, when you open a siddur, what is going on? We have nothing less than the power of life and death in our hands. We don't always see how it plays out. We don't always see it. But that's what's going on. Now, again, very consistent with the idea that we're partly God. I have no problems with this concept, by the way. But no, seriously, once you understand how high you are up on the level of a Bria, and that we are part of Hashem in the words of the Ramban, this is a game changer, nothing less than the power of life and death. Now, again, sometimes we think we know what we're asking for in tefillah, and we make a particular tefillah, and we might not be answered the way we thought we wanted, but we don't understand the ramifications that are going on. It's kind of like, there's this family of turtles that lives in this giant cardboard box, and one turtle goes to the other. He says, what do you think about that new carpet in the family room? What's a family room? He's lived his entire life in this cardboard box. He's never seen the family room. And that's who we are. We're in a cardboard box. We don't know the ramifications of what's going on and all the cheshbons of Shemayim. We don't. But that doesn't change the fact that the impact of our tefillas are nothing less than life and death. Move on from there and talk about the selflessness of Jewish women and Miriam and Yocheved. The examples are endless. How many of you have heard of Shalom Tzion Hamalka? Take out a book, do a Google search about her. She was a queen of a very evil king in Jewish history. She single-handedly saved the Sanhedrin during invasions of Eretz Yisrael. There are, again, there's an old adage that history is written by the victors. What they also don't tell you is that all the historians were men. So they don't tend to detail all the accomplishments and incredible feats of women through the generations. You don't have to go to Devorah, the Shofetes, and people like that all through Jewish history that we do know about. There's many that weren't cataloged because the men were the ones who were writing the history. But on top of that, you have people like Esther. Think about Esther for a second. And we all know the story of Purim and how Esther became queen to Achashverosh. And she didn't want to be Achashverosh's queen, but she was. And, well, Esther on a personal level is a tragedy. Esther never gets out of the palace. Bnei Yisrael are saved. We have the Yontif of Purim. Beautiful. Everybody's happy and singing. Not Esther. I'm sure Esther was happy and singing that she saved Klal Yisrael. But her story is a tragedy. She lives out her life in the castle. She never goes back to her original husband. She never gets to live life as a Jewess again. It's a tragedy. I'm sure that she didn't view it that way. And I could spend hundreds of hours explaining from the Megillah and things like that, how this was what Esther wanted. How she went to Mordechai and said, Mordechai, you have to daven so that I can go to Achashverosh. This is something that she wanted. All halachic ramifications. For example, you're probably aware that there's certain averos that you cannot commit even if under the threat of your life. Normally, if someone puts a gun to your head and says, violate Shabbos or I'll blow your head off, you can violate Shabbos. You have to protect your life. There are 3 averos that you can't do that for, and you're obligated to give your life. Gilui arayos, immorality, shfichas damim, murder, and avodah zarah. Those things you cannot do publicly. You'd be obligated to give up your life. Esther violated those 3. She went to Achashverosh willingly and gave herself to him. She's not allowed to do that. So how do we explain that? So again, there's many mefarshim and halachic sources that go into exactly what the cheshbon of Esther was. But the bottom line is that Esther gave up herself for the klal. And whether and when you can do that is a very difficult question. But no one can question the selflessness of it. To Esther, it was never about her. And that is the inherent quality of Jewish women all through history. The sacrifices they make for their husbands, for their children, for the klal. There's no men on that level. You could list hundreds of women that have made these sacrifices and decisions all through Navi and things of that nature. You could find a few men too that they rise to the occasion, but it's not even close. It's just not. Women are inherently have this beat of selflessness far more than men do. Because remember, we got to get back to our chair. We have to get back to our chair, the reclining chair with the. Okay. Okay, let's turn over the page now to source number 3. Another idea of women's intuition, which again, these are just Torah sources. This is not some Gemara or some Medrash somewhere. These are Torah Chumash sources. Vatikach Miriam, this is by Kriyas Yamsuf. Vatikach Miriam hanavia achos Aaron es hatof biyada, vatetze kol hanoshim achreha betufim lucholos. Miriam took all the women to join in the celebration of what was going on by Kriyas Yamsuf. And she took drums and musical instruments to celebrate. Comes to our small print right underneath. On the right-hand side, Betufim machalas. Uvtachos hayutzikanios shebedar shekadosh baruch hu osolahem nisim v'hotzi tachim mitzrayim. The women, the nashim tzidkanios, as Rashi refers to them, this wasn't a difficult thing for them. They saw all these nisim in Mitzrayim, and obviously there was going to be more nisim in the Midbar, so they were going to be ready. So they bought drums with them. The men are singing, dancing, doing the yeshiva shuffle, whatever men do. No. The women were ready to celebrate. They knew that the best was yet to come when they left Mitzrayim. Hashem didn't do all these nisim for us to take us out of the most powerful nation on earth so that he could drop us in the desert and fend for ourselves. The best is yet to come. And the women brought drums and musical instruments with them because they wanted to be ready to celebrate. There wasn't a guy thinking about that. He may have been going back to the Choshech places and getting his gold and making sure that came out with them. But the women were bringing musical instruments because they wanted to be ready to celebrate the nisim that were to come. There's dozens of sources like these. But the obvious conclusion that you can draw is the much holier level that women are on when it comes to not only intuition, not only selflessness, but spirituality in general. Women have a connection to Hashem that men can only dream about. I've learned more from my wife in that regard than I've ever learned from any svarim. The connection to Hashem between women is much stronger. Men have to think their way to God. For women, it's part of who they are. So it's an amazing gift, which you don't even realize that you have because it's who you are. And then I think we need to get to the final part, which is sources 4 and 5. This incredible creature called women that Hashem created can sometimes do things at their own peril. We all know that. I'll sit here in the dark. Famous, Jewish proverb. I don't need anything. I'm fine. That's part of being selflessness, and sometimes we have to combat it because it might not be the healthiest thing in the world. And I'm not suggesting that that's something that you should do all the time, because selflessness is a good thing. Nevertheless, there are certain other inherent female qualities which Hashem put in you to temper it with this idea to always put yourself at the back of the line. And sources 4 and 5 describe this perfectly. You're probably familiar with the story of the Ben Ish Mitzri. The Ben Ish Mitzri is a story at the end of Sefer Vayikra, where Hashem is talking about giving out halakim in Eretz Yisrael. The Ben Ish Mitzri, Rashi explains in source number 4, I don't have the Rashi there, just the Psukim, but the Psukim talk about this one person who had an Egyptian father. Rashi says he was the only child born to a Jewish woman during the entire Shibud Mitzrayim that had an Egyptian father. Rashi goes on to explain that it was actually the Mitzri that Moshe killed, that this Mitzri had taken a fancy to Shlomis Bas Yisraelis, whatever her name is, I forget exactly. It's here somewhere. I don't have it right in front of me, but her name. Anyway, and he would go wake up the husband sometimes early and tell him it was time to go out, and then he would go in and pretend that he was her husband, and that's how this person came to be. And the only time that a child was born to a Jewish woman with an Egyptian father. Well, when it came to the Midbar, he had no place to set up his tent because everything was done paternally. So he started living with Shevet Dan, which was his mother's Shevet. And for whatever reason, it didn't work out well. I don't know why. Probably because they started giving about halakim, and he's complaining, well, where am I going to be? I don't have a Jewish father. So the story goes that he comes out, and he's really upset. He's got no place to pitch his tent. And he says, Moshe Rabbeinu was corrupt. Hashem is unjust. Da-da-da-da-da. He ends up cursing Hashem and ends up getting Misa. One of the tragedies of Sefer Vayikra, this Ben Ish Mitzri. And certainly seems like, he brought it on himself to some extent. He's cursing Hashem. He's saying, that's not the way people conduct themselves. And tells you how Moshe Rabbeinu had to go ask Hashem, what's the punishment for cursing Hashem? I don't know. A few weeks later, in Parshas Pinchas, which we're going to read in a couple of weeks, you'll see source number 5. Source number 5 deals with the Benos Slavchad. Are you familiar with the Benos Slavchad? Sure. So the Benos Slavchad, their father, according to the Gemara, was what we call the Makoshesh Eitz. He was a person who was chopping wood on Shabbos for probably a good reason, according to the Gemara, but whatever it was, he died in the Midbar. And again, these women are in the same plight, these same sisters, because halakim are being given out by paternal heritage, and they have no father to get a chelik. So they're going to be without a place to pitch their tents. Their family will be nomads. And these sisters, the pasuk says in source number 5, "Vatikravna benos Slavchad ben Chefer ben Gilad ben Machir ben Menashe," from the Shevet of Menashe, and they say, listen, we don't have a father, and our halakim are being given out paternally. We don't have a place to come. Now, boiled down to its essence, that is the exact same complaint of the Ben Ish Mitzri. It's exactly the same. They're both saying that halakim and Eretz Yisrael are being given out by paternal heritage, and we have no father. The Ben Ish Mitzri ends up getting skila. He's put to death. Benos Slavchad get a chelik in Eretz Yisrael. That doesn't seem very just to me. It's the same complaint. What's the difference? There's only one difference. Tone. The Ben Ish Mitzri comes out, Moshe Rabbeinu is corrupt, Hashem is unjust, the whole system is... Benos Slavchad says, Vatikravna. They approached. It presented what appeared to be an injustice to Moshe and Aaron. And their request was answered and responded to. The exact same problem with unbelievably 180-degree different results. And the only difference is the way they presented it, which is a lesson I teach my kids from the day they can first start hearing. Tone matters. How we say something is sometimes more important than what we're saying. How we say it. Do we say it softly? Do we say it aggressively? There's an incredible difference. And that difference, again, here, difference between life and death. These little things that we take for granted as part of our daily lives, how we talk, how we daven, our life and death changes. And women have this oozing out of them all the time because women in general, not always, women in general are more soft-spoken than men. Women in general are more spiritual than men, and their tefillah is much more personal to them than it is to men. Why do men have a sitter? Ask a man, take 5 minutes out of your day and talk to your creator. Hey, God, how are things going today? It's just not the same thing. Ask women to take 5 minutes out of their day and talk to their creator, and the tears start flowing. There's differences. Women, when they actually have a few free minutes, hypothetically, because they never do, but women, when they actually would have a few free minutes, would be able to connect to Hashem immediately, much faster than men. We've got to put on our talis first. This is after we've done negovas, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This is after we put on our shoes and tie them and buckle them the right way and make sure. Now, then we get to shul. Then we put on our talis. Then we put on our tefillin. Then we open our siddur. Maybe now we can put our phones on vibrate and actually spend a couple minutes with God. No. See, women can do this at a red light. It's an amazing thing. And you think it's normal because it's who you are, to have these spiritual thoughts running through your mind all the time. It's not normal for men. Well, we've had some nice times here together, but I want to make sure you get your price of admission, your value. So I'm going to share with you a lesson of marital harmony, which took me years to learn, but there's now books called Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, all these types of things, right? And they tend to try to put into book form and cash in on things which I learned through the School of Hard Knocks. But in case you didn't know from the last hour, men and women are different. Communication, they can talk about all that, all these really, really important words that they try to put to it. I'm going to sum it up just like this. There was a study done about maybe 10, 12 years ago. They hooked up 300 men and 300 women to all types of machines that measure physical responses in the body. Heart rate, pulse, respiration, all these different things that they can measure physiologically in the body. And they asked the men, name the 3 biggest stressors in your life. And they asked these 300 men while they're wired up to all these machines. And by and large, the men reply, well, it's my parnassa, it's my all the things that men list that stress them out. And as the men talked about these things, their heart rate goes up, their pulse goes up, everything shows the body is under stress. The more they talked about it, the worse they felt. They asked 300 women, name the 3 biggest stressors in your life. And that's the kids and the relationship and all the different things that women talk about. And as the women talked about what was stressing them, their heart rates went down. Their pulse rate went down. Respirations, everything shows that the more they talked about them, the better they felt. Now, for anyone who didn't know, this is absolute proof that God has a sense of humor. Because he then decides, let's make these 2 creatures live together. So that way, when there's a stressful situation, what does man want to do? Read a book, play ball, watch a movie, do some computer, work, anything to take his mind off it. Because when he thinks about what's troubling him, he feels terrible. He feels stressed. And his lovely Ezer Kenegdo, Ashes Chayil, that God gave him to share life with, says, honey, we need to talk about this. Man, not understanding that women are created differently and their minds work differently, thinks, this woman is trying to give me a heart attack. And he gets angry. Meanwhile, his Ezer Kenegdo, Ashes Chayil, who loves him and a spiritual being, says, honey, we need to talk about this so I feel better. He now thinks she's legitimately insane. Because it doesn't make him feel better. Of course it doesn't make her feel better. And the only way to get past this dichotomy is with sensitivity. I have to understand your needs. You have to understand that when I come home from work and I go into my man cave and I play a computer game or I read a book or I play sports, whatever it is, it's not because I don't love you. It's not because I don't want to communicate with you. It's because I want to make sure I live another day. And I hear my heart rate going up and I feel my respiration going up. I've got to do something to take my mind off things. But my Ezer Kenegdo, my Ashes Chayil, the love of my life, she wants to talk about all the issues of the day that are facing us, which is the last thing in the world I want to do. Not because I don't want to, but because it's going to give me a heart attack. And my lovely Ashes Chayil, Ezer Kenegdo, has needs too. She needs to talk about these things because she's stressed. And she needs to relieve this stress by talking about it. And I need to understand that it's okay for my heart rate to go up a little bit. It's okay for me to be a little bit stressed if it gives her something that she needs, just not to take it to the extreme. But this is the most common thing I see in marital stress. Couples just don't understand the different natures of men and women. So that was worth your price of admission. You go home, your husbands are doing their man cave thing, whatever it is, whether it's learning, whether it's sports, whether it's a computer game. It's not because they don't love you. It's not because they don't want to communicate with you. It's because they're involved in the ever battle for self-preservation. I have a men's parallel here for this also, but they don't get it at all. They don't understand that you guys need to talk about things because it makes you feel better. It's the most foreign concept in the world does. But nevertheless, understand the gifts that Hashem gave you. The gifts that Hashem gave to the female are, in most ways, much greater than the men. You may be familiar with the idea that men make a bracha, shelo asani isha, in the morning. Many women are troubled by this idea. First of all, you don't understand that tefillah was never supposed to be viewed by women. The siddur was never supposed to be viewed by women. Tefillah is supposed to be something inherently personal. Talk to your Creator about what's on your mind, about what your needs are, what your wants are. Men need a siddur because they can't do this. We just don't know what to say. We feel like it's so abstract. It doesn't work for us. But what are the bracha shelo asani isha? All we're doing is thanking Hashem that you created this creature who in his natural state is reclining chair with beer in his hand. So we need mitzvahs from the moment we wake up in the morning to the moment we go to sleep at night. Because man with free time on his hand is a very ugly sight. It's not pretty. And we thank Hashem that because of those needs we have more mitzvahs. But again, any question you ever have about who's higher on the totem pole, just remember, I can't have a Jewish child. I can't, unless I have a Jewish mother. You could have a child with God knows what, and that child's going to be Jewish. Because of the incredible Bina Yisera of the Jewish woman. The Achilles heel of that, though, is that you have an early death because, you put everyone before you. And you have to temper that by understanding what the B'nai Shlachta understood. We have to sometimes temper the way we are just by tone, just by calming down a little bit and not do everything at 180 miles an hour. And sometimes just need to take a moment out, whether it means getting your nails done, whatever it means, you need some time for you. Because without you, we have nothing. We have no Jewish children, we have no Jewish houses, we have no anything. Women are the keys to Jewish lives and Jewish continuity. And if you don't take care of yourselves, you better really hope you got a really good husband. Okay? All right, thanks for coming, everybody. I hope you got something out of it today.